her. That was the first thing Mara Whitlock noticed when she pulled it from between the ledger pages on her father's desk, her name written in her father's hand on the outside, but the words inside meant for someone else entirely. A man she had never met, a man her father had apparently been writing to for months. Edmund Carraway will begin formal courtship of your daughter this coming November. Her father had already decided. He hadn't asked. He had simply decided, the way he decided which bulls to sell and which pastures to rest with calculation, without sentiment, without once considering that Mara might have already given her heart somewhere else entirely. She was still holding that letter when Gideon walked through the barn door and saw her face. And in that single moment, everything that had been quietly growing between them for 4 years became something that could no longer be ignored or survived. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, take just a second and hit that subscribe button. Every week I bring you stories like this, one stories about love that gets complicated, loyalty that gets tested, and ordinary people who have to make impossible choices. Hit the like button too, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let's get back to Mara standing in that cold barn, holding a letter that was about to change everything. The barn at Whitlock Crossing smelled like horses and old hay, and the particular cold that settles into Wyoming in October, the kind that doesn't bite so much as it simply stays, pressing itself against every surface until you stop noticing it's there. Mara had come in to check on the mare, that was all. A simple errand on a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of task she had done 1,000 times without thinking twice about it. She hadn't planned to stop at her father's workbench. She hadn't planned to notice the ledger sitting slightly open, with the corner of a folded paper sticking out from between 2 pages, like a flag someone had forgotten to hide. She almost didn't pull it out. Almost. The handwriting on the outside was her father's. She knew those angular letters the way she knew his voice, the way she knew the sound of his boots on the porch steps. Her name, her full name, which he only ever wrote formally when something important was being recorded. Mara Grace Whitlock. She unfolded it slowly. It wasn't a long letter. Silas Whitlock was not a man who used 10 words when 3 would do. But those 3 words, or rather those 3 sentences, landed in her chest like stones dropped into still water. Edmund Carraway has agreed, November after the last drive. Arrangements to follow. Mara read it twice, then a 3rd time, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something that made a different kind of sense. Edmund Carraway. She had heard the name exactly once, over supper, maybe 6 weeks ago. Her father mentioning a merchant from Cheyenne who had done well for himself. Prosperous, reliable. A widower with no remaining complications, as Silas had put it, meaning no children, no debts, no difficult history. The kind of man who represented, in her father's careful arithmetic, a guaranteed future. She hadn't thought anything of it at the time. She thought plenty of it now. The sound of the barn door was the only warning she got. Not a knock. There was never a knock in a working barn, just the groan of old hinges and then boots on the dirt floor, and she turned around still holding the letter without having had a single second to decide what to do with her face. Gideon Rusk stopped walking. He was carrying a bridle that needed mending, one hand wrapped around the leather, and he took one look at her standing there with that paper in her hands and just stopped. The way a man stops when he walks into a room and understands immediately that something has shifted, even before anyone explains what. Mara, just her name, nothing else, but the way he said it careful, like he was testing whether the ground would hold, told her he already knew something was wrong. She didn't try to hide the letter. There was no point, and besides, she was too angry for deception. Anger was the first thing she felt, clean and sudden and almost useful, the way anger sometimes is before the hurt underneath it catches up. He arranged it, she said, my father, without telling me. Without asking me a single thing, Gideon set the bridle down on the nearest post. His movements were always deliberate. That was one of the first things she had noticed about him, years ago. He didn't rush. He didn't fidget. Even when everything around him was loud and chaotic, Gideon Rusk moved like a man who had decided in advance exactly how much energy each thing was worth. He crossed the barn floor slowly and held out his hand for the letter. She gave it to him. He read it. His expression didn't change much. There was a small tightening around his jaw, the particular stillness that meant he was working something through internally and not yet ready to let it out. Then he folded it along the original crease and handed it back to her. "Edmund Carraway," he said. "You know him? Know of him? He came through here 2 autumns ago, looking at cattle. Your father showed him around the north pasture. A beat. He wore a city coat. It was such a specific, unnecessary detail that she almost laughed. She didn't, but she almost did. And Gideon must have seen that in her face because something shifted slightly in his expression, not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. Then it was gone. "How long has your father been planning this?" Gideon asked. "I don't know. I found this by accident." She looked down at the paper in her hands. "He never said a word to me, not a hint, not a question. Just arranged it, like I was a parcel he was posting somewhere." Gideon was quiet for a moment. Outside, one of the horses shifted in its stall, and the wind pushed against the side of the barn with a low, sustained sound, like something leaning its weight against the walls. "You're not going to do it," Gideon said. It wasn't quite a question. "Of course I'm not going to." She stopped. Because the thing was, it wasn't entirely that simple, and they both knew it. She wasn't going to do it, no. But not doing it meant having a conversation with her father that she had been quietly dreading for months, a conversation that would make explicit what had, until now, been allowed to remain unspoken between all 3 of them. "It's not that straightforward. I know. He thinks he's protecting me." "I know that too. That almost makes it worse," she said. "If he was being cruel, I could just be angry. But he's being careful. He looked at my whole future, and he made what he thought was the most careful choice, and he didn't once ask me if it was the choice I wanted." Gideon had his arms crossed now, not defensively, but like a man bracing himself for something. She had seen that posture before. She had learned to read him the way you learn to read weather on the range, not by any single sign, but by the accumulation of small things, the way the light changed and the air shifted, and the cattle moved differently before a front came through. "Mara," he said, and this time the way he said her name was different. "Quieter, more careful still, you know I." "Don't," she said. He stopped. "Don't tell me what you can and can't give me," she said. "Don't stand in this barn and start making the same argument my father is making from the other direction. I have heard enough from men who think they know what I need better than I do." Gideon looked at her for a long moment. The wind pressed against the barn again. "I wasn't going to say that," he said. "Then what were you going to say?" He was quiet for a beat that stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. "Then I don't know yet." That honesty, infuriating as it was so entirely Gideon that she felt something painful move through her chest. Because this was the problem with him, the specific, impossible problem. He didn't perform. He didn't offer grand reassurances he couldn't back up. He didn't tell her what she wanted to hear, and he never had, not once in 4 years, and she had always respected that about him, even when it drove her half out of her mind. 3 weeks ago, beneath the cottonwood at the edge of the east pasture, she had told him she loved him. It had not been a planned declaration. It had come out of a completely ordinary moment they had been watching the last of the evening light come off the mountains, and she had simply run out of reasons to keep the feeling contained any longer. He had looked at her for a long time before he responded. And what he'd said was, "I know, I've known for a while. I don't know what to do with it," which was, she had decided afterward, possibly the most honest and most maddening thing anyone had ever said to her. He had said nothing after that about love, but he had also changed small things, almost perceptible unless you were paying attention the way she always paid attention to him. He brought her coffee in the mornings before she'd asked. He showed up when something needed fixing before she'd noticed it needed fixing. Once, when she'd been exhausted after a brutal day and had simply sat down on the porch step and put her face in her hands, he'd sat down next to her without a word, and stayed there until she was ready to stand up again. It wasn't nothing, but standing in the barn with that letter in her hands, she needed it to be something more defined than that. "Gideon," she said, "I need to know if there's a reason to fight this." He looked at her directly. He didn't look away, and he didn't make it easy. And this was the moment she understood this clearly, even as she was living it. This was the moment that would determine a great deal about what came next. And he was quiet, not for a second or two, not for a brief pause while he gathered his thoughts. He was quiet for long enough that she understood what the silence meant. Not that he didn't love her. She knew he did. She had known it, probably, before he knew it himself. But love for Gideon Rusk had always existed in a completely separate compartment from what he believed he deserved. He had spent 32 years measuring himself against some invisible standard she had never been able to fully see, and whatever was on that scale, he had never once come out believing he had enough. "I can't promise you what Edmund Carraway can promise you," he finally said. She felt the words like a physical thing, not cruel, not dismissive. He wasn't being careless with her. She could see that in the way he looked at her, in the tension visible in the line of his shoulders. He was being, in his particular devastating way, honest. But the honesty hurt more than cruelty would have. "That isn't what I asked you," she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that, and she was angry about how hard she had to work to keep it that way. "I didn't ask you what you could promise me. I asked you if there was a reason to fight this." Another silence, and then Mara, no. She folded the letter. She put it in her coat pocket. "No, don't say my name like that. Don't say it like you're about to apologize." She walked past him. She didn't run. She had too much of her father in her for that. The Whitlock tendency to move through pain with a certain deliberate dignity, even when dignity was the last thing she felt. But she walked, and she did not look back. And she pushed open the barn door and went out into the gray October afternoon. She stood in the yard for a moment. The wind was sharp. The mountains to the west had that early winter look, the peaks fully white now, the color of the light at this hour, making everything look like a photograph of itself rather than the real thing. Her father was probably in his office, probably sitting behind that desk with the ledger open, making his careful calculations about her future, unaware that she had found the letter, unaware that anything had yet been disturbed. She could go in there right now. She could put the letter on his desk and say, "What is this?" And they could have the argument that was coming, the argument that had probably been coming for years. Since her mother died, and Silas's grief had gradually turned into a kind of controlled anxiousness about what would happen to his daughter if something happened to him. But she couldn't make herself move. Not yet. Not while her chest still felt like this. Because here was the truth she hadn't said out loud in the barn, the truth she hadn't been able to say to Gideon's quiet, pained, honest face. She had been certain. That was what made his silence so devastating. She had been absolutely certain that when it came to it, when the thing that needed saying finally needed to be said out loud, he would say it. She had been wrong. And now she was standing in a cold Wyoming yard in October, holding a letter about a man she'd never met, thinking about the man she'd left standing in the barn, and trying to figure out which of those two futures was more frightening. Inside the house, she could hear her father moving around. The familiar sound of his chair, the clink of the stove being opened, squared her shoulders. She had not grown up on this ranch to be the kind of woman who stood in the cold, sorry for herself. She was her mother's daughter, whatever her father sometimes forgot about that. Her mother had been a woman who walked into hard things directly, without flinching, and had taught Mara to do the same. So Mara went inside, but as she opened the door, she heard the barn door open behind her. She heard boots on the frozen ground. She didn't turn around. She went inside, and she let the door fall shut behind her, and she stood in the hallway for one moment longer, one single, private moment, and she pressed the letter against her chest, and she breathed. And then she put her face back together and walked toward her father's study. She didn't knock. Silas looked up from his desk. Big man, still carrying the frame that had made him formidable 20 years ago, though slower now, and grayer, and with something behind his eyes that had been there since the funeral, that particular kind of careful love that had curdled, just slightly, into something that controlled rather than protected. She put the letter on his desk. He looked at it for a long moment. He didn't pretend not to know what it was. I was going to tell you, he said. When? When it was settled. You mean when it was too settled to argue about? He didn't answer that, which was its own kind of answer. Papa, she said, and her voice was still steady. She was still holding it, though the effort was considerable. You made a decision about my life without asking me. I need you to understand that, I know that, and I need you to understand that it changes things between us. I'm trying to protect you, he said. I know you are. She pulled the letter back off his desk. That doesn't make you right. She left him sitting there, and she went upstairs, and she sat on the edge of her bed in the gathering dark, and she held the letter, and she thought about Gideon's silence, and she tried to figure out how you fight for a future when the person you most need to fight for it with you can't yet bring himself to believe he's worth fighting for. She didn't have an answer, not yet, but she had something else, the particular stubborn certainty that had always been her defining quality, the thing her mother had called her greatest strength and her father called her greatest inconvenience. She wasn't done. She was nowhere close to done. And somewhere on the other side of the yard, in a barn that smelled like horses and cold and 4 years of quietly accumulated feeling, Gideon Rusk stood alone with a bridle he'd forgotten to mend, and a silence he was already beginning to regret. Gideon didn't sleep that night. He tried. He lay on his cot in the foreman's quarters at the back of the bunkhouse, staring at the ceiling boards while the other hands breathed and shifted around him, and he tried to make his mind go quiet the way it usually did after a long day. It wouldn't cooperate. It kept circling back to the barn, to Mara's face, to the particular quality of her voice when she'd said, "That isn't what I asked you," not loud, not breaking, just steady in a way that was somehow worse than if she'd shouted at him. He'd stood in that barn for a long time after she walked out. Long enough for the cold to work its way through his jacket. Long enough for the mare to lose interest in whatever was happening and go back to her hay. Long enough for the light coming through the cracks in the boards to shift from gray afternoon to the flat white of early evening. He had not gone after her. That was the thing he kept coming back to, turning it over in the dark like a stone he couldn't stop picking up. He had not gone after her. He had stood there and let her walk away, and he'd told himself it was the right thing to do, that she deserved better than a man with wages and no land, that Silas's instincts about security were not entirely wrong. That love was not a practical answer to a practical problem. He told himself all of that. He still believed most of it. And he still felt like he'd done something unforgivable. By 4 a.m, he gave up on sleep entirely. He dressed in the dark, careful not to wake anyone, and went out into the cold to start the morning checks 2 hours before he needed to. The work helped. It always helped. There was something about the specific physicality of ranch work that quieted the loudest parts of his mind, the checking of water troughs, the condition of the fences along the near pastures, the slow circuit of the barn and outbuildings that he'd made so many times he could do it half asleep and usually did. But tonight even the work couldn't fully reach whatever was sitting in the center of his chest. He was at the water pump behind the main barn, working the handle with more force than strictly necessary, when he heard the back door of the house open. He knew it was Silas before he turned around. He knew the sound of that door, knew the particular weight of Silas Whitlock's tread on the porch steps. Had spent 4 years learning the rhythms of this property, the way you learn the rhythms of a person you spend most of your waking hours around. Silas came across the yard with his hands in his coat pockets and his breath making small clouds in the dark. He stopped a few feet away and looked at Gideon for a moment without saying anything. "You're up early," Silas said. "Couldn't sleep?" No, Silas looked out toward the pasture. "Neither could I." Gideon kept his hands on the pump handle, even though the trough was full. He needed something to do with them. "She found the letter," Silas said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, when?" "Yesterday afternoon." In here. Gideon tilted his head toward the barn behind him. She came to check on the mare. Silas made a sound that was not quite a sigh and not quite anything else, just a low exhale that carried a considerable amount of weight. I was going to tell her. I just wanted it settled first. I know. I imagine she told you that doesn't make it right. Those were more or less her exact words. Yeah. Silas was quiet for a moment. The darkness out beyond the yard was absolute at this hour, no moon. The stars hard and clear the way they got in October when the air was too cold to hold any moisture. Out in the pasture, a horse moved somewhere, the sound drifting in and then gone. Edmund Carraway is a good man, Silas said. He said it like a man reading from a list he'd memorized, something he'd rehearsed to himself enough times that the words had lost some of their conviction. He's steady. He's got more than enough to keep her comfortable for the rest of her life. He stopped. He's not me, Gideon said. Silas looked at him directly then. Silas Whitlock was not a man who looked away from difficult things, and he didn't look away now. He met Gideon's eyes with the particular expression of a father who has figured out something he was hoping he wouldn't have to figure out. No, Silas said. He's not you. The two of them stood there in the dark for a moment, 4 years of unspoken things sitting between them in the cold air. Silas, Gideon said carefully, whatever you think is happening. I think my daughter is in love with my foreman, Silas said. And I think my foreman knows it. That about right? Gideon didn't answer. That's what I thought, Silas said. He turned and looked back toward the house. The kitchen window had a light in it now, Mara. Probably. Up early the same way they both were. Moving through the house in that particular way she had when something was working in her, when she was thinking through a problem with her hands and her feet, because sitting still wasn't working. I don't have anything against you personally, Gideon. You understand that, I know. You're the best foreman I've ever had. I'd trust you with anything on this property. A beat. He stopped again, and this time the pause was longer, and when he spoke again, the rehearsed quality was gone from his voice. Her mother chose wrong at the start. Did you know that? Before me, there was another man. Family had money. They'd made an arrangement, not so different from this one. And she walked away from it to marry a cowhand from the Laramie Range who didn't own anything but a horse and an opinion. Gideon was quiet, waiting. It worked out, Silas said. Obviously, we built all this, but there were years. He shook his head. There were years when it was damned hard, when it was close. When I lay awake wondering if I'd done right by her, marrying her into that kind of uncertainty, he turned back to Gideon. I don't want that for Mara. That's not your choice to make, Gideon said. He said it as respectfully as he could manage, because he understood where it was coming from, and because Silas Whitlock had given him 4 years of fair wages and decent treatment and the kind of quiet respect that some employers couldn't be bothered with toward people who worked for them. I mean that with all the respect I've got for you. But it's not. Maybe not, Silas said. He sounded tired. Doesn't stop a man from trying. He looked at Gideon for another moment, something unreadable in his expression. What do you want, Gideon? I'm asking you straight. The question landed harder than Gideon expected, because it was the one question he'd been carefully not asking himself, the one he'd been maneuvering around for months, maybe longer. What did he want? As though his wanting was a legitimate thing to consider. As though the answer to that question had any practical weight at all. Doesn't matter what I want, he said. I think it might, Silas said. To her, anyway. He pulled his hands from his pockets and turned back toward the house. Carraway's coming in 3 weeks, to meet her formally. I told her last night. He paused with his back still turned. I'm not withdrawing the invitation, not yet, but I'm not blind, and I'm not a fool, and I'm telling you that because I think you ought to know what the timeline looks like. He walked back across the yard and went inside, and the kitchen light stayed on, and Gideon stood alone at the water pump in the dark, with a full trough and a completely empty sense of what he was supposed to do next. 3 weeks. He picked up the pump handle and set it back down and walked to the fence and stood there with his forearms on the top rail, looking out at nothing he could see. 3 weeks was not very long. The days that followed had a particular quality that Gideon had experienced before only during the most difficult stretches of hard seasons, a tightness in everything, a sense of pressure building somewhere just out of view. The ranch work continued the way. Ranch work always continued, indifferent to whatever was happening between the people doing it. Fences needed checking. Cattle needed moving. Equipment that had been putting off breaking down all summer finally started breaking down now, in the particular vindictive way that inanimate objects seem to save their worst problems for the coldest, most inconvenient weather. Gideon worked. He worked harder than he needed to, which was his longest established method of managing anything that was bothering him. And it worked about as well as it ever did, which was to say, it kept his hands busy and made the nights slightly more conducive to sleep. He and Mara kept working alongside each other the way they always had, because the ranch required it. But something had shifted. Not dramatically, there were no scenes, no sharp words, no theatrical silences designed to communicate injury. It was subtler than that. The particular ease between them, the shorthand they'd developed over 4 years of working the same land from dawn to dusk, had developed a small catch in it. A hesitation, the kind of thing nobody else would have noticed. Gideon noticed. He suspected she noticed too. She just wasn't giving him the satisfaction of acknowledging it. On the 5th day after the barn conversation, he found her on the east side of the property trying to remount a section of fence post that had come loose from the ground. She was making a competent job of it, as she made a competent job of most things. Mara Whitlock was her father's daughter in the most practical sense, raised with the understanding that the ranch made no allowances for helplessness, regardless of your gender. But the post was heavy, and the angle was wrong, and she was fighting it. He walked over without being asked. She didn't say anything when he took the other side of the post. They worked it back into the hole together. Without speaking, she held the angle right. He packed the dirt in tight around the base the way the old foreman before him had taught him. And when it was solid, they both stepped up back and looked at it for a moment. "Thank you," she said. "Sure," he started to walk away. She said his name. He stopped. "I'm not angry at you," she said. She was looking at the fence post, not at him. "I want you to know that." "I was. But I've had a few days with it, and I understand why you said what you said." Turned around. "Mara, I'm not asking you to explain yourself," she said. "I'm not asking for anything right now, actually. I just thought you deserved to know that I understand it." She finally looked at him. Her eyes were direct, the way they always were. Mara had never been a woman who looked away from things, even when looking at them was hard. You think the way you think, because life taught you to think that way. I don't blame you for that. He didn't know what to do with that. The generous version of him that she was always offering him, that she had always offered him, consistently, steadily, for years landed somewhere tender in his chest every single time. And every single time he didn't know how to hold it without immediately finding reasons to hand it back. "Edmund Carraway is coming in 3 weeks, he said. "I know my father told me." A pause. "I also know my father told you." Her voice was even. "He came to you first, the morning after we talked in the barn." He didn't deny it. He did. "What did you say to him?" "I told him it wasn't his choice to make regarding you." Something crossed her face at that, quick and complicated, not quite what he expected. "You said that to my father." "It's true. It's also the most you've said on the subject." She said it without accusation, just a kind of careful precision. "In 4 years, Gideon, in 4 years you've never once made me feel unwelcome. But you've also never once let yourself be anything other than careful." "Mara, I'm not complaining," she said. "I'm trying to tell you I see you. The real thing, not the version you manage." She picked up the mallet she'd left at the base of the fence post and held it loosely at her side. "My mother told me once that the hardest men to love are the ones who don't believe they deserve it. She said the love doesn't run out. They just keep testing it until they're certain it won't." She walked away then, back toward the barn, and he stood there by the mended fence post, listening to the sound of her boots on the cold ground until he couldn't hear them anymore. Her mother had died 3 years ago. The cancer had moved fast, too fast for much preparation, though Silas had prepared as much as a man could, which meant he'd prepared everything practical and nothing emotional. Mara had sat with her mother for the last 2 weeks, barely sleeping, and when it was over, she had come back to the work of the ranch with a steadiness that Gideon had found both deeply admirable and quietly heartbreaking. She didn't talk about her mother often, but when she did, the things she said were always precise. Always the kind of thing you turned over later and found more inside of than you'd initially seen. He thought about that all the way through the rest of the afternoon. He was still thinking about it the following week when Bram Veller showed up looking for work. Bram was 26, reasonably strong, and knew enough about cattle work to not be immediately useless. He'd worked 2 other spreads in the county, or so he said, and he had references that Gideon checked or tried to check, sending messages through the county relay, getting back responses that were positive enough but brief enough to raise a small flag he filed away in the back of his mind and didn't immediately pursue. Silas needed the help. The fall work was stacking up, and 2 of the regular hands had gone back to their families for the winter, which left the roster thin. Gideon gave Bram 3 days of observation work, watching him with cattle, watching how he handled himself around equipment and horses and other men, and what he saw was acceptable. Not exceptional, acceptable. He hired him on a trial basis. He was not sure why. Even at the time, he felt slightly uneasy about it. Nothing Bram did was wrong. He was polite enough, worked steadily enough, didn't make trouble in the bunkhouse. But there was something about him, a particular quality of watchfulness, a way he had of registering the layout of the property with slightly more attention than a new hand usually brought to it, that Gideon noticed and couldn't quite account for. He mentioned it to no one. He kept watching. In the second week after Bram arrived, Gideon caught him in a conversation with one of the other hands, a man named Teller, older, reliable, that stopped when Gideon came around the corner of the feed barn. Not guiltily, not dramatically, just stopped. The way conversations stop when a third party arrives and the first 2 aren't ready to include them. Gideon noted it. He did not react. The Thursday of that same week, Mara came to find him in the equipment shed where he was working on a wheel assembly that had been giving trouble. She came in without knocking. She never knocked. It was her father's property, and she sat down on a hay bale and looked at him working for a moment before she said anything. "Edmund Carraway is coming Saturday," she said. Gideon set down the wrench. "This Saturday," my father moved the date. He said there was a good window before the weather turns. She said it with the particular Whitlock precision that meant she was relaying facts because the facts were going to lead somewhere, and she didn't need to embellish the path. "He wants us to have supper, the 3 of us, 3 of you." "Yes." She looked at him steadily. "He hasn't invited you before you ask." "I wasn't going to ask. You were thinking it. He probably was." He picked up the wrench again and set it down again without using it. "What do you want me to say, Mara?" "I want you to say something honest," she said. Not careful, not managed, something honest. Outside the shed, the wind was picking up the quality of it different now, something purposeful in it. The way October wind in Wyoming started feeling less like weather and more like a forecast. A warning of what was building somewhere out on the range. "I think about you," he said. He said it looking at the wheel assembly, not at her. "That's honest enough." "I think about you considerably more than I have any business thinking about you, and I have spent the better part of 4 years convincing myself that was something I could manage by just being careful around it." He finally looked at her. "I'm not doing a great job." She didn't smile. She didn't do anything sentimental with it. She just looked at him with those direct eyes and said, "I know. I've watched you try. That's embarrassing. It's human," she said. "There's a difference." She stood up from the hay bale, brushing the back of her coat. "Saturday night, I'm going to sit through supper with a man my father has decided is my future. And I'm going to be polite because I was raised to be polite, and because it's not Edmund Carraway's fault that he's been put in this position." She paused at the doorway of the shed, half turned. "But I want you to know that whatever happens at that table, My opinion hasn't changed. And it's not going to change because a man arrives wearing a better coat than you own." She left. Gideon sat in the equipment shed for a while after that, not working, just sitting with the sound of the wind increasing outside and a complicated feeling in his chest that he didn't have an immediate name for. Saturday came the way things come when you're dreading them too fast, and somehow also with excruciating slowness every hour between Friday night and Saturday evening, feeling both rushed and interminable. Gideon kept himself busy with the fence check along the south pasture, which needed doing anyway, and which had the advantage of taking most of the afternoon and keeping him out on the far end of the property where he couldn't see the Cheyenne Road. He saw Caraway's buggy anyway. It was hard to miss a good vehicle, well-maintained, with a pair of matched bays that were clearly not working horses. They moved with the particular quality of horses that were kept for appearance as much as utility. The buggy rolled up the main drive at 4:30, and Gideon watched it from the hill above the south pasture, and then turned and went back to checking fence, because there was nothing else he could do. He ate supper in the bunkhouse with the hands. Bram sat at the far end of the table and was quieter than usual, eating fast and excusing himself early, which two men commented on, and Gideon filed away without comment. He couldn't sleep again. He lay on his cot listening to the wind, which had gotten serious now, a sustained, purposeful sound, the kind that usually meant something was changing out on the range, pressure building toward whatever came next. He was still awake when he heard Mara come through the yard at 9 o'clock, her boots quick on the frozen ground, not quite running but close to it. He heard her go up the porch steps and into the house. Heard the door close. He lay there for another hour and told himself it was none of his business. At 10:30, he gave up on telling himself anything and went out. The yard was dark and still. The house had one light upstairs, her room, the particular warm square of it he could have identified at any distance. He stood in the yard and looked at it and felt completely ridiculous and also completely unable to walk away. He didn't call to her. He didn't throw stones at windows. He sat on the fence by the barn and waited, because patience was the one thing he had in genuine abundance, and because some part of him believed she would know he was there. She appeared at the back door 20 minutes later. She had a coat thrown over her house clothes, and her hair was down, and she walked across the yard in that particular. She had, when she was very tired, and the careful posture she maintained all day had gone out of her. She sat on the fence next to him, not close enough to touch, just next to him, the way she'd sat next to him 100 times over 4 years. The two of them, and the dark, and the cold, and whatever was out there on the other side of the fence. "How was supper?" he said. "Thorough," she said. He waited. "He's not a bad man," she said. "Edmund, he talks a lot. He has opinions about everything, and he shares all of them without particular invitation. But that's not cruelty. That's just a certain kind of man." She paused. "He asked me exactly one question all evening." "What did he ask?" "He asked if I rode horses," she said it flatly. "I've spent my life on this ranch." My father was sitting right there, and he asked me if I rode horses. Gideon was quiet for a moment. "What did you say?" I said occasionally. A pause. Said that was good, that he kept a lovely mare at his house in Cheyenne and I was welcome to use her when I was in town. The silence that followed, that was not uncomfortable. It was, in fact, the most comfortable silence Gideon had experienced in 2 weeks, because there was something in the specific awfulness of that anecdote that removed the need for any complicated response. "He doesn't know you at all," Gideon said. "No, he doesn't." She turned and looked at him. "You do." There it was again. The direct thing, the true thing, offered without any attempt to soften it or dress it up or make it easier to deflect. Gideon looked at her in the dark and thought about 4 years of coffee in cold pastures and shared silences, and the way she'd sat beside him on the porch steps the evening she was too tired to stand up and heed. Just stayed there because leaving hadn't seemed right. He thought about the cottonwood 3 weeks ago, and what she'd said and what he'd said back, and whether a man could spend his entire adult life believing he was the wrong amount of everything, and then simply decide not to anymore. He didn't know, but he was starting to think the not knowing was the wrong reason to stay quiet. Mara, he said. She waited. I don't have an answer for your father's question, he said. About what I can give you. I don't have land or a merchant's business or a house in Cheyenne. I have wages I've been putting aside for 3 years because I kept thinking maybe someday I'd have enough to. He stopped. I don't know what I thought I'd do with it. Buy into something. Start something. I hadn't let myself think that far ahead. Why not? He looked out at the dark pasture, at the horses he could hear but not see, shifting and breathing somewhere out there in the cold. Because thinking that far ahead meant admitting what I wanted. And what I wanted felt like something I didn't have the right to. The wind moved through the yard. An owl somewhere behind the barn sounded once and went quiet. Gideon, she said, and her voice was steady but lower now, the particular register she used when she was being completely serious. What do you want? He looked at her. She looked back. And this time he didn't let the silence fill, with all the practical reasons he'd been cataloging for 4 years. This time, he let himself look at her face, really look, not the managed. Careful look he'd been giving her in doorways and across pastures and in barn conversations, but the actual look, the one he'd been keeping carefully in reserve. You, he said. It came out simpler than he intended, and less, and also more. I want you. I've wanted you for long enough that I've run out of ways to pretend otherwise. He looked back at the pasture, because looking at her while he said the rest of it was too much. I don't know what that's worth, against everything your father's offering you with Caraway. I genuinely don't know, I know, she said quietly. He looked back at her. I know what it's worth, she said. I've always known. I was just waiting for you to figure it out. She didn't move toward him. She didn't reach for his hand. She just sat there on the fence rail in her coat, with her hair down in the cold night air, and looked at him with the particular expression of a woman who has been patient for a very long time and whose patience has not run out but is also not infinite. Edmund Caraway is coming back, she said. My father invited him for the following week. A proper visit, he said, with a formal question at the end of it. I know, so you have a week, she said. I'm not issuing an ultimatum. I'm telling you the truth about the timeline. Because you deserve the truth, and because I'm not going to wait for you to be ready and then find out you never quite got there. She slid off the fence rail and stood on the frozen ground, looking up at him. I love you, Gideon Rusk. That hasn't changed. I don't expect it to change. But I also grew up on this ranch, and I know that sometimes an animal that's been frightened long enough forgets how to trust even when the threat is gone. She held his eyes for a moment longer. I'm not asking you to be unafraid, she said. I'm asking you to be brave anyway. She walked back across the yard. She went inside. The back door closed with its particular quiet sound, and the light upstairs stayed on for another hour. Gideon sat on the fence rail in the dark and cold and listened to the wind and thought about fear and bravery, and whether those two things were as different as people made them sound. And somewhere on the south pasture, where he had spent the afternoon checking fence he hadn't been paying enough attention to, something was already moving through the dark that would, space of a single night, change everything. He just didn't know it yet. He almost missed it entirely. That was the thing Gideon kept coming back to afterward, in the days when the dust had settled and the sheriff had gone and the ranch had returned to something resembling its normal rhythms. If he had slept that night, if the conversation with Mara on the fence rail had left him peaceful enough to close his eyes and stay down, he would never have been out there. He would have been in the bunkhouse like the rest of the hands, and the south pasture fence would have stayed cut until morning, and by morning there would have been nothing left to find. He didn't sleep. He sat on that fence rail for a while after Mara went inside, long enough to get properly cold, and then he walked back to the bunkhouse and lay down and stared at the ceiling boards and thought about every single thing she'd said. Not just the last part, the part about bravery, the part that was still working somewhere behind his sternum like a splinter he couldn't reach, but all of it. The supper with Caraway, the question about riding, the mare in Cheyenne, the particular flatness in her voice when she described a man who had sat across from Mara Whitlock for 2 hours and found exactly one thing worth knowing about her. He thought about the savings he'd never let himself think a purpose into. 3 years of wages put aside in a strong box under his cot, added to steadily and never touched, a habit born from some instinct he hadn't fully examined. He thought about the adjoining parcel to the north, the Hennessy place, abandoned since old Carl Hennessy died 2 winters back, the land sitting idle, the price reasonable for anyone who had 3 years of careful savings and some willingness to work harder than was strictly advisable. He thought about all of that, lying in the dark, and then somewhere around midnight he heard something. He couldn't have said exactly what it was. Not a loud sound, nothing that woke the other men, nothing that would have registered as alarming to anyone who wasn't already awake and already listening. Just a quality in the night that was different from the quality it had been an hour ago. A particular kind of stillness that wasn't restful. He sat up. He pulled on his boots and his coat without fully deciding to, the way you do things when your body understands something before your mind has caught up with it, and he went out into the cold. The yard was empty. The house was dark now. Mara's light had gone out sometime in the last hour. The horses in the near paddock were standing in the configuration they used when something had disturbed them. Heads up, facing a direction, not panicked but alert in a way that meant they'd registered something worth registering. Gideon followed the direction they were looking, south. He took his rifle from inside the bunkhouse door quiet, no lantern, nothing to announce himself, and he went south. The south pasture was the furthest point of the Whitlock property in that direction, bordering the county trail that ran between Whitlock Crossing and the next spread over. It was also, Gideon now remembered with a particular coldness that had nothing to do with the weather, the section of fence he'd checked 2 days ago and marked for repair, a stretch where 2 posts had gone soft in the ground from the early freeze-thaw cycles, leaving the wire loose enough to be pulled aside by anyone who knew where to look. He moved fast and quiet across the frozen ground. He smelled them before he saw them. Horses, more horses than should have been on the south end of the pasture at this hour, and beneath that the particular mix of sweat, and leather, and unwashed wool that meant men who had been riding and were now waiting. Lower. The cloud cover had thinned enough to give him a fraction of moonlight, not much but enough, and as he came around the rise above the south fence line, he could see the gap where the wire had been pulled wide and staked open, clean, deliberate opening maybe 12 feet across. Through it, 3 of the Whitlock cattle had already been moved to the far side, standing confused and unhappy in the dark outside their own fence. 3 men were working the rest of them toward the opening. Moving carefully, not rushing, the practiced quiet of people who had done this before. 2 of them he didn't recognize. The third, working the left flank of the small gathered group, was Bram Veller. Gideon stopped behind the rise and made himself breathe slowly and think clearly. 3 men. He had 1 rifle and the element of surprise, which was worth considerably more than it would be worth in 30 seconds if he used it wrong. The cattle were not fully bunched yet. They were still being worked into position, which meant there were another few minutes before the real movement started. The 2 unfamiliar men had rifles slung across their backs. Bram had a revolver on his hip. Gideon had noticed it the first day and thought nothing of it because a lot of men carried revolvers and a lot of them had perfectly ordinary reasons for doing so. He had a decision to make, and he had about 90 seconds to make it. He could go back, alert the ranch, get Silas and whatever hands were in the bunkhouse and come back in numbers. That was the sensible choice. That was what a careful man would do. The problem with that choice was the 20 minutes it would take, and the fact that 20 minutes was enough time to move those cattle a considerable distance down the county trail in the dark. He didn't go back. He came down the far side of the rise in a wide arc, staying low, keeping the wind in his favor, moving across the frozen ground with the particular quiet that 4 years of early mornings and late nights on this property had given him. He knew every dip and rise of this pasture. He knew where the ground went soft near the creek bed on the eastern edge. He knew exactly where to put his feet and exactly what to avoid, and he used all of it, circling around until he was positioned above and behind the place where the three men were working. He got within 30 feet before Bram's horse registered him. The horse didn't spook. It just shifted and turned its head, and that was enough. Bram turned too. With the instinct of a man who'd learned to pay attention to what his horse was looking at, and he saw Gideon standing in the thin moonlight with a rifle. The two other men turned. For a moment, nothing moved. The wind, the dark, the confused cattle, and four men looking at each other across 30 feet of frozen Wyoming ground. Bram, Gideon said. He kept his voice level, not loud. There was no need to be loud out here. Put the revolver on the ground. Bram didn't put the revolver on the ground. He drew it. Gideon had been expecting that, which was the only reason the next few seconds went the way they did, rather than considerably worse. He was already moving when Bram's hand went to his hip, not toward Bram, but sideways, hard and fast, taking himself off the line. Bram was drawing before Bram had finished drawing it. The revolver went off. The sound was enormous in the night quiet. The cattle bolted in 3 directions. One of the unfamiliar men went for the rifle on his back, and Gideon put himself behind the nearest horse, Bram's horse, as it happened, still tied to the fence post, and used the animal's sudden, terrified movement as cover. What happened next was not clean. It was not the kind of thing that looks composed in the telling of it afterward. It was loud and cold and confused, and Gideon's hands were shaking by the time it was over, not from fear. Exactly. But from the particular adrenaline that doesn't care whether you're frightened or angry. It just moves through you and shakes whatever it finds. Bram's horse, already frightened by the shot, tore its tie and lurched hard to the left. The momentum of it caught Bram across the shoulder and knocked him sideways, not down, but off balance, his gun hand going wide, and in the half-second of his stumble, Gideon closed the distance between them, faster than he'd moved in years. He hit Bram's gun hand with the barrel of the rifle, not a blow designed to injure, so much as one designed to make Bram's grip stop working, and the revolver went into the dark dirt. Gideon got a foot on it. He had the rifle on the other 2 men before they'd fully processed what had just happened. "Leave them," he said. "The slung rifles, both of you. Hands where I can see them." The older of the 2, a heavy-set man with a beard going gray, the one who'd been working the right flank, looked at Gideon with the particular expression of a man running a fast calculation and not liking what it came out to. Then he put his hands up. The younger one followed. Bram was on one knee in the dirt, holding his gun hand against his chest, breathing hard. He looked up at Gideon with an expression that was partly pain and partly something uglier, the face of a man who has been caught and knows it and hasn't yet decided what to do with that knowledge. "How much are you into them for?" Gideon said. Bram stared at him. "The gambling debt," Gideon said. "These 2, or the people they work for." "How much?" Bram's jaw worked for a moment. "More than I can pay." "So you decided to pay it with Whitlock cattle." Bram didn't answer. He didn't need to. Gideon made the 2 standing men sit down on the ground and told them to stay that way. He found the rope they'd brought coiled near the fence opening, ready for use during the drive, and used it to bind their wrists with the particular efficiency of a man who had spent many seasons working cattle and knew how to secure something that didn't want to be secured. He did Bram last. Through all of it, he was aware of the cattle. The ones that had bolted were not far, just spooked, moving in confused circles in the dark. The 3 that had already been moved outside the fence were standing about 50 yards down the county trail, looking uncertain. He gathered the cattle back first before he did anything else, because they were Whitlock cattle, and that was the job. Took the better part of 40 minutes, working in the dark with the 3 men sitting tied on the frozen ground, cursing occasionally, while he quietly moved the animals back through the fence opening and got them settled in the near section of the pasture where they would hold until morning. Then he repaired the fence. He used what Bram's people had brought to open it, to close it back up, the wire cutters, the posts they'd loosened, the extra wire they'd had coiled in their saddlebags, because professionals brought supplies. He worked by feel more than sight, and it wasn't his best fence repair, but it was solid enough, and when he was done, the gap was gone. The whole time, he kept expecting someone from the ranch to appear drawn by the gunshot, which had been loud enough to wake the dead, let alone a yard full of sleeping hands. Nobody came. He found out later that the wind had been running the wrong direction to carry the sound back to the buildings. Just his luck, or just the particular indifference of Wyoming weather toward the timing of human crises. He left the 3 men sitting bound by the fence and rode hard back to the ranch. He didn't go to the bunkhouse. He went to the house because Silas needed to know and needed to know now, and because waking Silas at midnight was a conversation Gideon had never had before and didn't especially want to have but had run out of ways to avoid. Silas answered the door in his boots and his nightshirt and his coat, which meant he'd heard something after all and had been up. He looked at Gideon's face and stepped back immediately to let him in. Gideon told him in as few words as possible. He was concise by nature, and urgency helped. He laid out what he'd found, what he'd done. The cattle, the fence, 3 men, Bram. Silas listened without interrupting. His face went through several different things, while Gideon talked shock, anger, something calculating, something else that Gideon didn't have a name for, and when Gideon was done, Silas stood very still in his kitchen for a moment. Bram Veller, he said. Yes, I hired him, Gideon corrected. On a trial basis, the references were thin, and I should have pushed harder on them. Silas shook his head, not in disagreement exactly, more like a man setting something aside to deal with later. You've got them tied at the south fence. Yes. And the cattle are back in, all of them. Silas looked at him for a moment with an expression Gideon couldn't fully read in the low kitchen light. Then he moved to the hallway and called up the stairs. Mara appeared at the top in 30 seconds, which meant she'd been awake too, probably had been awake since the shot, lying in the dark, trying to figure out what she'd heard and whether it was something or nothing. Get dressed, Silas said. Ride to the Prentice place and get their boy to carry word to Sheriff Aldous. Tell him we need him at the south fence before dawn. He paused. Gideon will go back and keep watch. She looked at Gideon. Just looked for one moment, and he looked back. And then she was gone back into her room, and the sounds of her moving quickly and purposefully drifted down the stairs. Silas turned back to Gideon. He had that still, deliberate quality that Gideon recognized as the man at his most controlled the things Silas did when he was feeling something considerable and was absolutely not going to let it out until he'd decided what to do with it. How many cattle? Silas said. 3 got through the fence. I brought them back before I repaired it. The rest were still being worked into position when I got there. So they got 3, for about 40 minutes. Then they didn't have any. Silas nodded slowly. He looked at the table. He looked back at Gideon. You went out there alone. Yes, in the dark, against 3 armed men. 2 with rifles, 1 with a revolver. Gideon kept his voice even. The rifles were slung. Bram drew but missed. His horse helped. His horse helped, Silas repeated, in the particular tone of a man who has just heard something that will be both reassuring and infuriating for a long time. Yes, sir. Silas rubbed his face with one hand. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, they could both hear Mara crossing the yard toward the stable, quick and efficient. That could have gone a great deal worse, Silas said. I know, you could have been shot. Bram missed. By circumstance, yes, Gideon said. By circumstance, he paused. I thought about going back and raising the alarm first. The math on that was 20 minutes, and those cattle would have been halfway to the county line. Silas looked at him again, that long, unreadable look. Go back and keep watch, Silas said. I'll be right behind you. Gideon went. He stood by the south fence in the cold for another hour, listening to Bram and the 2 other men be variously resentful and then increasingly uncomfortable in their bound positions on the frozen ground. He didn't engage with them. There was nothing to say to them and nowhere productive for the conversation to go, so he said nothing, just stood there in the dark with his rifle, and watched the county trail and listened for anything moving in the darkness beyond the fence. Silas arrived with two of the hands roused from the bunkhouse. He looked at the three men on the ground with an expression that was not particularly warm. He looked at the repaired fence. He walked the length of it slowly, checking the work with his hands in the dark, and then he came back and stood next to Gideon and didn't say anything for a while. The sheriff arrived just before 4 in the morning with a deputy and a pair of lanterns, and the next hour was the particular slow business of legal procedure applied to a cold field in the dark statements given. Men transferred to the deputy's custody, horses gathered and accounted for. Sheriff Aldous was a lean, unhurried man who had been doing this work long enough to not be agitated by the hour or the temperature, and he took Gideon's account of events with the calm of a man transcribing rather than evaluating. Bram said very little. He had the look of a man who had run out of calculations and was now simply waiting for the results of someone else's. When they were taken away, the deputy leading their horses up the county trail and the lanterns disappearing into the dark, the remaining quiet felt enormous. Silas stood at the fence and watched them go. He didn't speak for a long time. The sky was beginning to do the thing it did in the last hour before dawn, not lighter, exactly, but a different quality of dark, as though the darkness was thinning at its edges. The cattle in the near pasture were settling, the disturbance of the night working out of them slowly. "What those cattle are worth," Silas said finally, without turning around. "The 3 that got through the fence. Do you know?" "Roughly," Gideon said. "More than 4 months of your wages." "Yes. All 3 of them. Back in the pasture, fence repaired, 3 men tied and waiting for the sheriff." Silas turned around. In the thinning dark, his face was hard to read, but his voice was not. "Because you couldn't sleep. Because something sounded wrong," Gideon said. "Why were you awake?" Gideon didn't answer immediately. He looked at the fence. He looked at the pasture. He looked at the place where the lanterns had disappeared up the county trail. "Thinking," he said. "About what?" "A long pause. About what I want," Gideon said. "And whether I've got the right to want it." Silas looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked back at the pasture, at the cattle settling in the gray pre-dawn, at the fence that had been cut open and then repaired and was now as solid as it was going to be until morning when Gideon could get a proper look at it in the light. "A man who fixes the fence before he comes back for help," Silas said slowly, as though he was working something out and speaking it aloud at the same time. "When most men would have left it and come back as fast as they could." "Why'd you do that?" Gideon thought about it honestly. "Because the cattle were back in," he said, "and a fence that's still open is still a problem. Even at midnight, even alone, even after you'd just been shot at. It needed doing." Silas made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite anything else. He turned and started walking back toward the ranch buildings, and Gideon fell into step beside him because there was nothing else to do and because the dawn was coming, and with it, the work that never stopped. They walked for a while in silence. The frost on the ground was beginning to show itself in the early gray, each blade of dead grass, with its individual coating of ice, the whole field glittering faintly at the edges of visibility. "My wife would have liked you," Silas said, not looking at him. Gideon didn't say anything. "She had a talent for knowing what a man was worth that I never fully had," Silas continued. "I calculate she knew." He was quiet for a moment. "She would have known about you from the first week." They reached the yard. The bunkhouse had a light in it now, the hands up and moving in the aftermath of the night's events, and there were voices from inside that would require managing shortly. The house was also lit the kitchen window, which meant Mara was back from the Prentice place. Silas stopped at the edge of the yard. He turned to face Gideon with the look of a man who has been reorganizing something fundamental in his thinking and has arrived at a conclusion he wasn't expecting when he started. "What I'm about to say," Silas said, "I'm saying once. And then I'm not going to say it again, because I'm not a man who repeats himself, and I'm not a man who explains himself more than the once. You understand? Yes. Edmund Carraway is a decent man with money and property and a house in Cheyenne. And he sat across from my daughter for 2 hours and asked her whether she rode. Silas held his eyes. You have been on this property for 4 years. You know my daughter. You know what she's worth and what she's capable of and what she actually needs, because you paid attention when it wasn't required of you, and because she's never had to explain herself to you from scratch. A pause. That counts for something I failed to put in my calculations. Gideon kept very still. I'm not withdrawing Caraway's invitation, Silas said. Not yet. That's still Mara's business and not mine to decide. His voice was measured, deliberate, each word placed carefully. But I'm telling you that if you've got something to say, you've got my attention. And if what you're thinking about doing with those savings involves the Hennessy parcel and a great deal of difficult work, I might know someone at the bank in Laramie who thinks well of me and who makes reasonable arrangements. He turned and walked to the house and didn't look back. Gideon stood in the yard while the gray dawn spread itself across the sky and the hands came out of the bunkhouse in ones and twos, and the ranch began, as it always did, to come back to life around him. He was still standing there when the kitchen door opened and Mara came out. She had her coat on and her hat and her riding gloves, which meant she'd come back from the Prentice place and gone straight back out rather than going in. She'd been in the yard somewhere. Watching, he didn't know how much she'd heard. From the look on her face, he thought possibly all of it. She walked across the yard toward him. She stopped a few feet away and looked at him in the early light, and her face was doing that thing it did when she was feeling something considerable and was deciding how much of it to let show. You fixed the fence, she said. It needed fixing. Gideon. She said his name the way she'd said it in the equipment shed, the way she'd said it in the barn, the way she'd been saying it for 4 years with that particular freight of meaning that he'd spent 4 years carefully not fully receiving. You could have been killed. I wasn't. That's not. She stopped. She pulled in a breath. That is not a satisfying answer. I know, he looked at her. The dawn was coming in properly now, the light changing from gray to the pale gold of early morning, and in it she looked tired and fierce and exactly herself, which was the thing about her that had always stopped him cold, even when he was trying hard not to let it. I wasn't going to let them take your father's cattle. Cattle, she said immediately, and then something shifted in her expression, like she'd surprised herself. He felt that land somewhere in his chest. Mara, he said. Don't, she said. But this time the word was different from the barn, not cutting him off, more like bracing herself. I've been thinking about the Hennessy place, he said. She went very still, the parcel to the north. It's been idle since Carl died, and the price is reasonable, and the land is its good land. It just needs work. The well needs restoring, and the fences are a mess, but the soil is. He stopped. He was talking about the land when that wasn't the thing he was trying to say. I have money put aside. 3 years of it. I've had it sitting under my cot for 3 years not doing anything, because I never let myself decide what it was for. She was looking at him with an expression he couldn't fully name. I think I've known what it was for, he said, for a while. I just wasn't ready to admit it. The morning came on around them. A rooster somewhere across the yard, the sound of horses beginning to move in the paddock. 2 hands going past with their heads down, studiously not looking at their foreman standing in the middle of the yard, having what was clearly a personal conversation. Are you saying what I think you're saying? Mara said. I'm saying I've been an idiot, he said, about what I'm worth and what I have the right to want. And I'm saying, I know that doesn't fix everything, and I know you've been patient with me for a long time, and I'm not asking you to be patient any longer. He held her eyes. I'm asking you to. I'm asking if you'd be willing to build something with me. Not inherit something. Build it. The silence between them was the kind that has weight. The Hennessy place, she said. It's a mess, he said. The well's been dry for 2 winters. Half the outbuildings need to come down and be rebuilt from scratch. It would take years to make it into something. I know, she said. I've ridden past it. I've thought about it. He looked at her. Have you? More than once. The edge of something that was almost a smile. I'm a rancher's daughter, Gideon. I look at land the way you look at fence. Outside the kitchen window, if either of them had been paying attention to it, Silas Whitlock stood with his coffee cup and watched the yard, his face arranged into something that was not quite an expression, and was not quite the absence of one, the face of a man who has recalculated and found that the new answer, while unexpected, is not worse than the old one. He turned away from the window before they could notice him watching. Mara took one step closer to Gideon, not dramatically. Just one step, which in the cold morning air of a Wyoming ranch yard was the most important step either of them had taken in 4 years. "I need you to be sure," she said quietly, not just brave. Sure. He thought about the fence in the dark, about fixing it before he came for help because it needed doing, and that was that. About standing in a cold field at midnight because something had sounded wrong, and the cattle were Whitlock cattle, and Whitlock cattle were his responsibility, and that had never once been something he had to think about. It was just true. The way gravity is true, the way the mountains to the west are true every single morning, whether you look at them or not. He thought about that, and he thought about Mara's face in the barn 3 weeks ago, and Mara's face on the fence rail, and Mara's face right now in the pale gold of an October morning, and he understood with a sudden, almost physical clarity that the question of what he was worth had never once been the real question. The real question was what he was going to do with what he had. "I'm sure," he said. She held his eyes for a long moment. Then she nodded once, the way she nodded when she'd made a decision and was ready to move to the next thing. "Then we have a fence to properly repair," she said. "And after that, I want to ride out and look at that well." She turned toward the barn, already moving, already purposeful, and Gideon stood in the yard for one more moment in the October morning light before he followed her. The well at the Hennessy place had been dry for 2 winters, and when Mara lowered the rope with the weighted end down into it that same morning, they both listened to it fall without hitting anything for a long time. "That's not nothing," Mara said, which was her way of saying it was a serious problem without committing to the position that serious problems couldn't be solved. Gideon crouched at the edge and looked down into the dark. He could smell the particular mineral cold of a well that had gone dry from the bottom up, rather than from drought, which meant the channel had shifted, not disappeared. That was the difference between a dead well and a difficult one, and he'd seen enough of both to know which this was. "It's not gone," he said. The water table moved, probably when the creek changed course after the flood 2 years ago. "You'd have to dig out and redirect. How long would that take?" "Weeks, maybe 6, depending on what's down there." She looked at him across the well opening. "You've done it before." "Once, on the Laramie Range. Took us 8 weeks and 2 men with sore backs for a month after." So 8 weeks, 2 sore backs, and 1 functional well. If we're lucky with the rock layer. She stood up and looked at the property around them, the collapsed fence line to the east, the outbuilding with the roof half-gone, the fields that had grown wild and matted from 2 years without cattle working them. It was a considerable amount of hard work laid out in every direction, honest and unambiguous about exactly what it was. She looked at it the way she looked at everything on this ranch, not with the romantic optimism of someone who hadn't done the work before, but with the practical assessment of someone who had. "This is going to be harder than it looks," she said. "It looks pretty hard already," Gideon said. "I know." She turned to face him. "Still want to do it." He looked at her across the abandoned well, on an abandoned property on a cold October morning after a night. Neither of them had slept, both of them standing in the wreckage of something that had once been a working ranch and could be one again. And he understood something about her in that moment that he had understood in pieces before, but never quite completely. Mara Whitlock was not in love with the idea of hard things. She was not the kind of woman who romanticized difficulty or found suffering instructive. She just had the very specific quality of not being frightened by the size of a task when the task was worth doing, and she had decided this one was. He had spent 4 years working beside that quality without fully reckoning with what it meant to build a life with it. "All right," he said. She nodded once. "Then we need to talk to my father." They rode back to the ranch together, not quickly, letting the horses set their own pace, while the October morning spread itself across the range, and the light went from pale gold to the fuller brightness of mid-morning. They didn't talk much on the ride. There was a lot to think about, and neither of them were people who talked through things they were still working out. But they rode close, closer than they usually did, their horses shoulder to shoulder on the trail. And once when Gideon's horse drifted slightly, Mara didn't move hers away. It was a small thing. It was not a small thing. Silas was in the barn when they got back, which was where he usually went when he was thinking through something he didn't want to think through in the house with the walls around him. He was working on a harness that didn't need working on, the kind of task you give your hands when your mind needs somewhere to go. He looked up when they came in. He looked at them both, together, and then he looked back at the harness. "How's the well?" he said. "Redirected water table," Gideon said. "We can dig it out. That's a significant job, yes." Silas worked the harness for a moment. The barn was quiet except for the horses and the particular creak of the building settling in the mid-morning cold. "The Hennessy price," Silas said. "What do you know about it?" "Enough," Gideon said. "I've looked into it. The estate's been trying to move it for 18 months. The price is reasonable for someone with the savings and the willingness to work it back up." "Do you have the savings?" Yes, Silas set the harness down on the bench and turned to face them fully. He was a man who aged in concentrated bursts rather than gradually. Gideon had noticed it over 4 years. The way Silas would look essentially the same for months and then, during a difficult calving season or a long drought, show a year's worth of age in 2 weeks. He looked older this morning than he had yesterday, but not in the way of weakness. More like the way a man looks after he's stopped fighting something and accepted its weight. "I spoke to Aldous this morning," Silas said, "before you were back. He's going to need you to come in and give a formal statement about last night, Gideon. Bram and his associates aren't disputing what happened, which helps. But the county will want it documented. I'll go this afternoon." "Good," Silas looked at his daughter Mara. "Papa." "Edmund Carraway is still coming next week." She held his eyes. "I know. I want you to understand that I'm not canceling that visit out of what happened last night," Silas said. He was choosing his words with a precision that told Gideon he'd been working out what he wanted to say for most of the morning. "I'm not a man who makes decisions on sentiment, and I don't want you thinking that last night's events have clouded my judgment about what's practical and what isn't." "They haven't clouded your judgment," Mara said. "They've clarified it. There's a difference." Silas looked at her for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, the corner of his mouth moved in something that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. "Your mother used to say things like that," he said. "I know. She said things like that to me too." Something passed across Silas's face, brief, private, the particular expression of a widower who gets ambushed by his wife's presence in his daughter's voice. He turned back to Gideon. "What I'm going to say to Edmund Carraway when he comes," Silas said, "is that I've reconsidered the arrangement. That Mara's situation has changed in ways I wasn't anticipating. That I wish him well." He paused. "That's my decision to make. Not because Gideon caught cattle thieves, not entirely. But because I spent half of last night thinking about what I was actually arranging when I wrote those letters. And I didn't come out of that thinking with a good feeling about it." Gideon said nothing. "I arranged it," Silas continued. And there was something rougher in his voice now, less composed, because I've been afraid. Since Eleanor died. Since I looked at Mara and understood that she was the last person I had in this world, and that someday I won't be here and she'll have to manage everything alone. It wasn't about Mara's happiness. Not really. It was about my fear. He said it like a man admitting something he didn't fully enjoy admitting. That's not good enough. The barn was very quiet. Mara crossed the distance to her father and put her hand on his arm, and Silas looked at her hand for a moment and then put his own over it, briefly, before he cleared his throat and stepped back and picked up the harness again, because he was Silas Whitlock, and there was a limit to how much of this he was going to do in front of his foreman. "The bank in Laramie," he said, returning to the practical with visible relief. I'll write a letter to Henry Marsh. He owes me from the '89 negotiation, and he knows good land investment when he sees it. The Hennessy parcel is sound if someone with sense is working it. He'll make you a fair arrangement on the difference, if your savings don't cover the full price." "I appreciate that," Gideon said. "Don't thank me yet. The interest rate will probably still annoy you." He set the harness down again and looked at them both with the expression of a man who has said all the difficult things he intended to say and is now ready to be done with the conversation. "This doesn't happen fast," he said. "You understand that. The Hennessy place is going to take years. You'll both be working this ranch and that one at the same time, and there will be seasons where it feels like too much." "I know," Mara said. Gideon. Silas looked at him directly. "I'm going to ask you the question I should have been asking from the beginning, and I want you to answer it straight." "All right. What can you give her?" It was the same question he'd asked in the dark yard 3 weeks ago, and Gideon had deflected it then, offered the honest but incomplete answer about what he couldn't give rather than what he could. He didn't deflect it this time. "Not property," he said. "Not immediately. Not money or a name that means anything to anyone in this county. Not a house in Cheyenne." He held Silas's eyes. "I can give her someone who actually knows her. Who knows how she thinks, and what she values, and what kind of work makes her feel like herself, and what kind doesn't. Someone who's never tried to make her into something easier to manage." He paused. "I can give her a partner. I can give her a piece of land that we build into something from the ground up, together, that belongs to both of us, because we both put the work in. I can give her someone who will be there for the hard seasons as well as the easy ones, not because it's required, but because—" He stopped. He looked at Mara and then back at Silas. "Because there's nowhere else I want to be." Silas looked at him for a long time. Then he nodded. One firm, deliberate nod, the way he nodded when he'd made a decision about something and was done deliberating about it. "Then you'd better write to Marsh before the end of the week," he said. "The estate won't hold that price through winter if they get another offer." He picked up the harness and walked to the far end of the barn, and the conversation was over in the particular way that Silas Whitlock ended conversations, not rudely, not dismissively, just completely, as though a door had been closed on the subject from the inside. Mara looked at Gideon. Gideon looked at Mara. "He just gave us his blessing," she said quietly. "He gave us practical advice about property financing," Gideon said. "For my father, those are the same thing." That almost made him laugh, which was a feeling he hadn't expected to have this morning after the night he'd had, and the almost law surprised him enough that it showed on his face. And she saw it, and something in her expression shifted, softened. "Maybe" was the word, though that wasn't quite right either. More like settled, like something that had been held slightly in tension for a long time had been allowed to rest. She reached out and put her hand briefly against his arm, the way she'd put her hand on her father's arm, and he put his hand over hers the way her father had done. And then they both let go, and she walked toward the barn door and said over her shoulder that they needed to get the south fence properly checked in daylight, and she wanted to do it before noon. He followed her. Edmund Carraway arrived the following Thursday. He came in the same matched bay buggy, the horses still too well kept for serious work, and he brought with him a wooden crate with a bottle of good whiskey and a tin of tobacco, and what he described, upon presenting it, as a very fine piece of smoked ham from a shop in Cheyenne. He was well dressed, as he had been at supper, and he was not an unkind man. Gideon, who observed his arrival from across the yard while pretending to inspect the water trough, made a serious effort to see him clearly rather than through the particular filter of personal stakes. Edmund Carraway was 42 years old and had built something from nothing which counted for something. He spoke well, carried himself with the confidence of a man who was used to his opinions being well received, and he had made a genuine effort with his appearance for what he clearly understood to be an important occasion. He was not a villain. He was just a man who had been told that a young woman on a Wyoming cattle ranch was available to be courted, and who had arrived to conduct that courtship with the same practical efficiency he presumably brought to his business arrangements. The problem, and it was not a small one, was that he did not once look at the land when he stepped out of the buggy. He looked at the house. He looked at Silas, who had come out to meet him. He looked at the smoked ham he was handing over with the air of a man presenting a compelling argument. He did not look at the mountains. He did not look at the cattle in the near pasture. He did not look at the way the light came off the frost on the fence rails, or the way the horses moved in the paddock, or any of the 1,000 things that constituted the actual life of this place. Gideon went back to inspecting the water trough. He didn't see Mara until the afternoon, when she came out of the house with the particular expression of a woman who had been polite for several hours and was now in need of a fence to fix. She walked past the water trough and said without looking at him, "He asked me if I found ranch life isolating." Gideon kept his eyes on the trough. "What did you say?" "I said I found it clarifying." He said nothing. "He laughed," she said. "He thought I was being wry." She kept walking toward the equipment shed, with the stride of a woman with a destination and a purpose, and Gideon looked at the water trough for a moment longer and then went back to work. Silas met with Edmund privately after supper. Gideon was in the bunkhouse and he didn't try to overhear what was said and didn't need to. The result was clear enough from the quality of sound that came through the ranch yard afterward, Edmund's buggy leaving earlier than expected. The matched bays moving at a slightly faster pace than they'd arrived at, and then the particular silence of a yard after something has concluded. Silas came to the bunkhouse door 20 minutes later. He stood in the doorway and looked at Gideon with the expression he used when he was delivering information that he had already finished processing and expected the recipient to process equally efficiently. "It's done," he said. Gideon nodded. "He was gracious about it," Silas said, which told Gideon that Edmund Carroway was, in fact, a decent man, whatever else he was. He said he appreciated my forthrightness. He's got a nephew in Laramie who introduced him to a widow with property on the East Range. So Silas shrugged. "He'll be fine. I expect he will." Silas looked at him for a moment. Marsh wrote back, "Faster than I expected. His terms are reasonable. I'll have the letter on the kitchen table in the morning." "Thank you, Silas. Stop thanking me," but there was no edge in it. He turned to go, then stopped. "There's a minister in Casper. Mara's mother knew him. He does a proper ceremony without a great deal of fuss." He didn't look back. "Just information," he left. One of the hands on the far end of the bunkhouse, a man named Cutter who was 50 years old and had worked cattle ranches his entire life, looked up from his cards and said, without particular inflection, "Well, that's settled then." Nobody disagreed with him. The weeks that followed were among the strangest of Gideon's life, not because anything dramatic was happening after the drama of the night at the South Fence and the departure of Edmund Carroway and the conversation in the barn. The ranch entered a period of relative quiet, but because ordinary things had stopped feeling ordinary, and that took some getting used to. He still did the same work, still rode the same pastures, checked the same fences, managed the same rotating cast of complicated personalities that constituted a working ranch crew in October. But something about all of it had shifted slightly on its axis. The way a room looks different after you've moved one piece of furniture technically the same, but with the light falling differently. He wrote to Henry Marsh at the Laramie Bank with the particulars of the Hennessy parcel, enclosing a bank draft for the portion his savings covered. Marsh wrote back promptly. Silas had evidently softened the ground considerably, with terms that were not comfortable but were manageable, and that Gideon read 3 times, and then signed before he could talk himself into reconsidering. He sent the papers to the estate agent on a Wednesday morning. Thursday, Mara found him at the north fence and said, without preamble, "Did you send them?" "Yesterday." She absorbed that for a moment. "So it's real." "It's real." She looked at the horizon, then back at him. "You scared?" He thought about that honestly. "Yes," he said. "But not about the same things I used to be scared about." She nodded slowly, like that was the right answer, or at least an honest one, which in her estimation were usually the same thing. The formal arrangement between them, what Mara called a formal arrangement with the particular precision she used when she meant something that sounded small and was actually significant, was made not with dramatic declarations but over the kitchen table on a Sunday evening with Silas present, drinking his coffee and looking at the wall with the studied neutrality of a man who had decided to be present at this conversation without involving himself in it. Gideon had not prepared a speech. He had thought about preparing one and decided against it, because prepared speeches were the kind of thing he always saw through in other people, and Mara would see through his in about 30 seconds and find the artifice of it off-putting, which was the last thing he wanted. He told her what he'd told her at the well, more or less. That the Hennessy place was theirs if she wanted it. That the work would be significant and the timeline long and there would be hard seasons. That he knew her better than he knew almost anything else in his life, and that felt like the foundation he wanted to build on. She said yes, not dramatically, not tearfully. She said yes, with the same directness she brought to everything, looking at him across the kitchen table with her father studying the wall, and then she said, the minister and Casper. My father mentioned him. He did, Gideon said, in the spring, she said. After calving, when there's a reasonable window. That works, he said. Silas got up from the table and put his coffee cup in the basin and went to bed without saying anything, which was his way of saying everything was acceptable. The winter that followed was the hardest Gideon could remember in 4 years at Whitlock Crossing. And he had a suspicion it was not coincidence, but simply the nature of things, that the seasons reserved their worst for the moments when you felt you finally had something worth protecting. The first real storm came in November, earlier than anyone expected, dropping 2 feet of snow in 3 days and making the south pasture nearly inaccessible. They lost 2 cattle in the first week. Not to the storm directly, but to the complications it caused a calf already weakened from a difficult birth, an older cow that had been declining for a month and simply didn't have enough left for a hard winter on top of everything else. These things happened. Gideon had been through enough hard seasons to know they happened even when you did everything right, and that knowing it in advance didn't make it much easier when you were standing in a frozen pasture watching it happen anyway. What surprised him was how he felt about it, not differently than before, exactly. He'd always taken losses on this ranch. Personally, he was that kind of foreman. It was part of what made him good at the job. But there was a quality to it now, a specific weight, because the ranch he was working to protect was edging closer in his mind to something that would be partially, permanently his, and loss felt different when it was practice for the real thing. He said something like that to Mara one evening, badly articulated, sitting at the kitchen table after a particularly long day with a cup of coffee going cold in front of him, and she listened to the whole stumbling explanation and then said, "You're starting to understand what my father felt every winter for 30 years. Is that a good thing? It means you're not a hired hand anymore," she said. "In your head, I mean. You're doing the math differently." He looked at the cold coffee. When did that happen? "I think it happened a while ago," she said. "I think you just didn't let yourself notice until now." The Hennessy deed came through in December. Cold Tuesday. The kind of day that made Wyoming feel like the edge of everything habitable. And Gideon was in the equipment shed when Silas came to find him with an envelope from the estate agent, which he handed over without comment and then left, because he was Silas and ceremony was not his preference. Gideon opened it alone, in the equipment shed with the cold coming through the gaps in the walls and the sound of the wind outside being full and serious about itself. He unfolded the paper. He read the relevant line. The parcel described herein is hereby transferred to the ownership of Gideon Rusk. He read it again. He sat down on the hay bale Mara had sat on in the fall, when she'd come to find him working on the wheel assembly, and had told him she understood him even when he didn't make it easy. He sat on that hay bale and held the deed and did not do anything particular, just sat with the fact of it for a while. This piece of paper that said a thing he had spent 32 years believing was not possible for a man like him. He didn't feel triumphant. That surprised him. He'd expected triumph or at least relief, and what he felt instead was quieter than that a kind of bedrock settling, like something that had been slightly unstable for years had found its proper footing. Not perfect, not finished, but solid in a way that felt permanent. He put the deed back in the envelope. He went to find Mara. She was in the house at the kitchen table, working on the ranch ledgers the way she did every month. The long columns of figures that she managed with a precision her father had taught her, and she had exceeded him in years ago, though Silas would never entirely admit that. She looked up when he came in, and he held up the envelope without saying anything, and she looked at it for a moment, and then at him. She put down her pen. She stood up from the table and walked to him, and he held out the envelope, and she took it and held it in both hands, not opening it, just holding it. "It's real," she said, which was what she'd said when he told her he'd sent the papers. But it sounded different this time. More final, more settled. "It's real," he said. She looked at him with the direct eyes that had been looking at him clearly for 4 years, seeing what he was without requiring him to be something else first. And he thought about all the ways he'd maneuvered around what he felt and what he wanted, because he hadn't been ready to believe he had the right to either. And how a piece of paper in an envelope had not created that right, but had somehow made it real in a way that the feeling alone had never quite managed. "There's a lot of work to do," she said. "Starting with the well," he said, "and the east fence, and the roof on the north outbuilding." "Years of it," she said. "Yes." She looked at the envelope in her hands. Then she looked at him. "I'm not afraid of the work, Gideon." "I know," he said. "I've never once thought you were." She handed the envelope back to him. He put it inside his coat, against his chest, which was perhaps the most sentimental thing he'd done in 32 years, and they both had the grace to not comment on it. Outside the kitchen window, Silas was crossing the yard in the December cold, moving with the deliberate, steady pace of a man who has things to do and intends to do them, and he didn't look toward the house. But there was something in his gait that was different from the gait he'd had in October, something that sat differently on him, less tightly, as though he'd set something down that he'd been carrying for 3 years since Eleanor died and hadn't noticed the weight of until he finally put it on the ground. He didn't look toward the house, but Gideon, watching through the kitchen window, thought he saw the older man's pace ease slightly as he crossed the frozen yard. It might have been nothing. It might have been everything. The winter deepened around Whitlock Crossing, as Wyoming winters did, without apology, without particular interest in the timing or convenience of the people trying to work inside it. January came in hard and stayed. The Hennessy parcel sat under 2 feet of snow for most of February, inaccessible and waiting, the abandoned well sealed under ice, the broken fences invisible under drifts. The whole problem of it preserved by the cold and waiting for spring with the particular patience of land, which was not patient in the way people were patient, straining and deliberate and effortful, but patient the way rocks were patient. Simply there, simply unchanged, simply waiting to be worked. Gideon knew the feeling. He'd been that kind of patient for a long time. Now he was learning a different kind, which was harder the patience of a man who has decided what he wants and is doing the work, and can see the shape of it in the distance, which is both better and worse than not being able to see anything at all. Mara worked the ranch books through January and February, through the calving season that started in late February and ran brutal and exhausting into March, through the mornings that started before dawn and ended in darkness, and asked for everything you had and then a little more. She worked it the way she'd always worked, without complaint about what it cost her, with the particular steady quality that was, Gideon had come to understand, not the absence of feeling, but its disciplined management. She got angry. She got tired in ways that showed on her face when she thought nobody was watching. She made one significant error in the calving records in February and caught it herself 3 days later and said something sharp and precise about it to no one in particular, and then corrected it and moved on. She did not become easier to be around during hard stretches. She became more herself, which was a different thing, more direct, less filtered, quicker to say exactly what she thought, and then move on to the next thing. Gideon, who was also more himself during hard seasons, and who had spent a significant portion of his adult life having that treated as a liability, found it something close to restful. Not easy, never easy, but restful in the way that solid ground is restful, not comfortable exactly, but reliable, and reliable was the thing he'd been missing without fully knowing it for years. The minister in Casper was, as Silas had promised, a man who did a proper ceremony without fuss. They went on the second Saturday in April, after the worst of calving was done, and the Hennessy Well project had been started, and the spring weather had given them 2 consecutive dry days, which in Wyoming in April was a thing you acted on when you got it. Silas drove the buggy. Mara sat beside her father. Gideon rode alongside on the horse that was, technically, still the best asset he personally owned. The ceremony was 30 minutes. The minister knew Mara's name because he had known Eleanor Whitlock, and he spoke with the particular care of a man who was aware of the significance of absence as well as presence. Silas stood beside his daughter with the expression of a man holding himself together through sheer structural integrity. Gideon stood at the front of a small room in a church in Casper, Wyoming, and watched Mara Whitlock walk toward him, and thought about the barn in October, and the fence in the dark, and the kitchen table in December, and the cold morning, when she'd said our cattle and surprised herself. And he thought that the sum of all those moments was what a life was actually made of. Not the ceremony, but everything that came before it, and everything that would come after. She reached him. She looked at him the way she always looked at him, directly, clearly, without any of the softening or performance that some people wrapped around important moments to make them feel safer. "Ready?" she said quietly, just to him. "I've been ready for a while," he said. "I know," she said. "I watched you get there," the minister began. The well came in on a Thursday in late May, 6 weeks and 3 days after they started digging. Gideon was down in the shaft when it happened 12 feet below ground level, working with a short-handled spade in a space narrow enough that he had to keep his elbows in, the kind of work that made 32 years feel considerably older. He'd been hitting the same dense clay layer for 2 days, the kind that gave nothing without a fight, that took everything you could put into a stroke and gave back about half an inch of progress per swing. His shoulders had stopped hurting 2 days ago, which was either a good sign or the sign that the nerves had simply decided to stop reporting. He hit something different. Not a sound, exactly more a quality in the resistance, a slight giving where there had been nothing but solid refusal. He hit it again. Same thing. He crouched down in the narrow dark and pressed his palm against the clay at the base and felt moisture. "Not much. Just enough, Mara," he called up. Her face appeared at the top of the shaft, backlit by the May sky. "What?" "Drop the test rope." A pause. Then the weighted rope came down. He guided it into the clay at the base and felt it sink 3 inches before it stopped. "Pull it up," he said. She pulled it up. 30 seconds of silence from above. "Then it's wet." He pressed his hand against the clay again. The moisture was spreading slightly now, a slow seep from somewhere below that made the clay around his palm feel different, colder, more alive. "We've got it," he said, another pause from above. "Longer this time, Gideon." Her voice was different. Not dramatic. Mara was never dramatic, but different. "Come up." He climbed the rope ladder, which was harder than it should have been because of the shoulders, and came out into the May morning, blinking and covered in clay. And Mara was standing at the edge of the well casing, with her arms crossed and her expression doing the thing it did when she was feeling something she hadn't yet decided how to express. He looked at her. She looked at him. 6 weeks, she said. 6 weeks and 3 days. You said 6 weeks, maybe. I said 6 weeks if we were lucky with the rock layer, he said. The clay was worse than the rock. We were lucky, she said. With the rock layer, the clay was where we weren't lucky. Correct, she uncrossed her arms. She looked at the well casing, at the rope ladder, the state of him, which was, objectively, not a clean state, and then she looked at the property around them. The east fence was repaired. The north outbuilding had a new roof, or most of one. They were 2 days from finishing it. The fields were still rough. still carrying the evidence of 2 years of neglect. But there were places where the ground had been worked and where the grass was coming in differently, more deliberately, the way land responds when someone has started paying attention to it again. It looked like what it was, a property in the early stages of becoming something. "My father's coming out this afternoon," she said. "He said he had something to look at on the north boundary." "He's been finding reasons to come out here about twice a week," Gideon said. "I know. He's checking on the progress. He's checking on us," Mara said. "The progress is just what he uses as the reason." She said it without any criticism in it, just the matter-of-fact clarity she used about her father, who she understood better than anyone and loved without illusion, which was the most honest way to love anyone. He's not going to say that, obviously. She turned to look at the well. "We should get it properly cased before he gets here. I'd rather tell him it's done than tell him it's close." He looked at the well, at the sky, at the position of the sun. "We can get it cased by noon if we start now." "Then let's start now," she said, and she picked up the casing materials they'd had ready for a week and got to work, and that was that. They got it cased by 11:45. Gideon pumped the handle for the first time at 1:15, and they both stood there watching the water come up. Not clear at first, muddy and reluctant. The way water always came from a new source before it found its confidence, and then gradually cleaner, until it was running clear and cold over Gideon's hand and pooling in the small collection basin they'd built at the base. He looked at Mara. She was looking at the water with an expression that reminded him, suddenly and specifically, of her face in the barn in October, the same quality of someone who has been holding something very carefully for a long time and has been proven right to hold it. Different circumstances. Same face, well, she said. "Yeah," he said. She put her hand under the water. She held it there for a moment, feeling the cold of it. Then she pulled her hand back and dried it on her coat and said, "Practically, we'll need to run it for a few days before we trust it for the cattle. 3 days minimum. I'll put the mark on the calendar." She turned toward the half-finished outbuilding. "We should get back to the roof before my father arrives and find something else to have opinions about." He followed her, and neither of them said anything more about it, and it didn't need anything more said about it because the water was there, and it was real, and in the particular economy of how Gideon and Mara communicated about things that mattered. The action spoke, and the moment spoke, and words on top of that would have been decoration. Silas arrived at 2:30 with a specific theory about the north boundary's drainage that he expounded on while walking the fence line. And Gideon and Mara walked with him and responded in the places that required response, and let him talk in the places that didn't. And at the end of it, Silas stood at the well casing and pumped the handle twice and looked at the water that came out, and then at Gideon, and then at the property generally. He said. That was all, but the way he said it carried, for Silas, a considerable amount of weight. He stayed for supper. They had started keeping the small kitchen in the Hennessy farmhouse functional, not comfortable exactly, but functional. Enough to eat there on working days, rather than riding back to Whitlock Crossing twice, and over the meal he was quieter than he usually was, which with Silas was saying something. He ate with the focused attention of a man who is thinking rather than tasting, and twice he looked around the small, rough kitchen with its 2 unmatched chairs and its single window, and the wall that still needed replastering on the east side, and his expression was, one Gideon had started to recognize over the months a kind of recalibration, the look of a man whose prediction has failed to materialize exactly as predicted, and who is adjusting his model accordingly. The roof looks solid, Silas said, toward the end of the meal. 2 more days on the north section, Gideon said. Then it's done. The east fence is better than I expected. Mara did the corner posts, Gideon said. I would have set them 2 inches shorter. Silas looked at his daughter. Mara was eating and did not acknowledge the compliment with anything more than a slight shift of expression, which meant it landed. You'll need to decide about cattle before fall, Silas said. If you're going to run anything on this pasture by next spring, you need to start the herd this year. Even a small one. We've been talking about it, Mara said. 6 head to start. Gideon knows a man in Laramie who has good stock at a fair price. Riley, Silas said. Riley, Gideon confirmed. Silas nodded. He's honest. Go to him before August, or he'll have sold the best of them. He pushed his plate back slightly, the signal he used when a meal was over, whether or not he'd finished everything on it. I'll tell Henry Marsh the well is in. He'll want to know it's the main variable he was watching on the property valuation. The loan terms, Gideon said. You've been making the payments. Every month, Silas looked at him. I know, he said. Marsh told me. He mentioned you'd sent the February payment 3 days early. There was something in his voice when he said it, not surprise exactly, more like the final settling of a long calculation coming out right. He said he wished more of his customers operated the same way. Gideon said nothing. I told him I wasn't surprised, Silas said. He said it plainly, without theater, and then he stood up from the table and put on his coat and told them he'd see them at the main ranch Friday for the fence work on the west pasture, and he left. The small kitchen was quiet after he went. Mara looked at the door he'd left through. He's proud of you, she said. He said he wasn't surprised. For my father, those are the same thing. She started clearing the plates. He hasn't used the word proud about another person since my mother's funeral, and then only about her and only once. You should take what he gave you as what it was. Gideon thought about that while he helped clear the table, turning it over the way he turned things over, looking at it from different sides. I'm going to need to find a replacement foreman for him, he said. For the main ranch, I can't keep doing both, not once we have cattle of our own to manage. Mara was quiet for a moment. He knows that. Has he said anything? He's been asking around quietly. There's a man from the Sheridan range he's been corresponding with. She set the dishes in the basin. He won't ask you to stay longer than you can give. He's not, she paused, finding the right word. He's rearranged his expectations. He does that slowly, but when he does it completely. Like his daughter, Gideon said. She turned and looked at him. Like his daughter, she agreed, without any self-consciousness about it. The summer came on fast and physical, the way Wyoming summers did no gradual warming. Just a hard shift from spring cold to summer heat that gave you about 2 weeks of something almost pleasant before it became work you did in spite of the temperature rather than with its cooperation. The Hensey place consumed everything Gideon and Mara could give it and then demanded slightly more, which was the nature of land in the early years of being reclaimed. They rode out before dawn and worked until the light failed. And in between, they did the thing that neither of them had fully understood they'd be doing until they were inside it. They learned each other in a different way than they'd learned each other. Over 4 years of working the same land. Not worse than what they'd had before, and not separate from it, but deeper. More complete. The kind of knowing you only get from sharing small spaces and long days, and the particular closeness of two people trying to build something from almost nothing, which creates its own specific intimacy that has less to do with sentiment and more to do with trust, the operational kind. Kind built from watching someone make a decision under pressure and learning whether their instincts and yours are compatible. Mostly they were. Not always. In July, they had their first real argument. Not about feelings, not about any of the things they might have argued about in the charged months before the barn conversation. And the night at the south fence. About the east pasture. Gideon wanted to fence it differently than the original configuration, a longer run to the south that would give them better rotation options with the cattle they were planning to bring in. Mara thought the original configuration was right for the water access and thought his longer run would create drainage problems in a wet season. They argued about it for 3 days, not quietly. The first day was heated enough that one of the hands Gideon had brought on part-time found reasons to be somewhere else for most of the afternoon. On the third day, Mara got a piece of paper and drew out both configurations and the drainage grades she'd estimated from the land contours. And Gideon looked at it for a long time and then said, with some difficulty, that she was right about the drainage and his configuration would create a mud problem in a wet that would cost more to deal with than the rotation benefit was worth. She did not say, "I told you so," which he respected. She did say we should have drawn it out on day one, which was accurate and which he also, privately, respected more than he showed. They built her fence configuration, and when the following March turned wet, the drainage ran exactly the way she'd calculated. And he watched it run correctly and thought about the kind of partnership that required you to be wrong sometimes, and to say so clearly, and to build the other person's fence without making them pay for being right. That was the thing nobody told you about the person you built a life with. Not the ceremonies and not the declarations and not even the hard seasons. It was the East Fence argument. It was the willingness to look at someone else's drawing and say, yes, you're right, and mean it. Silas's new foreman arrived in August, a man named Walt Dresser from the Sheridan Range, 45, quiet, methodical, who had the same quality of practical reliability that Gideon had built his reputation on, and who looked at the Whitlock operation on his first day with the expression of a man who knows good work when he sees it and is pleased to be inheriting it. On the day Walt formally took over the role, Silas came to the Hensey place in the evening, unannounced, which was his version of marking an occasion. He stood at the fence of the near pasture, properly fenced now, solidly set, the posts true, and looked at what had been done with the land since December. Gideon stood beside him. They looked at it together in the evening light, the repaired outbuildings, the working well, the east fence built to Mara's specification, the fields that still needed years but were responding, the small beginnings of something that could, in time, become what they were working toward. It was a mess when you bought it, Silas said, still is in places. Less of one. We've got 3 years of real work ahead before it runs the way I want it to, Gideon said. Maybe 4. That's about what I thought when I'd started Whitlock Crossing, Silas said. He was quiet for a moment. The evening light was doing what it did in August, in Wyoming, turning everything gold and making even the rough edges of things look deliberate. Took 5 years before I felt like it was mine rather than a problem I'd agreed to have. When did it stop feeling like a problem? Silas thought about it. When Eleanor planted the kitchen garden, he said. We'd been there 5 years, working it, fighting it, and one spring she planted a kitchen garden on the south side of the house, and I looked at it and thought she's done that because she believes we're staying. And that was the first time it felt real. He was quiet again. Not the deed. Not the first season we turned a profit. The kitchen garden. Gideon looked at the Hennessy farmhouse. There was no kitchen garden on the south side, but there was a window Mara had cleaned last week and put a canning jar in, full of late-season wildflowers from the east field, and that morning he'd noticed it from across the yard and felt something that was probably adjacent to what Silas was describing. She's planning a garden, Gideon said, for next spring. She's been talking about where the light hits best on the south wall. Silas looked at the farmhouse for a moment. Something in his face moved, private and quick, and then settled. Good, he said. That's good. They stood there a while longer in the August evening, 2 men at a fence looking at land, and the conversation found its natural end, the way Silas's conversations always did, not with a conclusion, but with a silence that had said enough. The 6 head of cattle came from Riley in September, as planned. They were not the most impressive cattle Gideon had ever managed. Riley was honest, as Silas had said, and honest meant he'd sold them animals that were sound rather than showy, young enough to have years of productivity ahead of them, manageable enough for a small operation to handle without the full crew of an established ranch. Gideon and Mara drove them themselves from the Riley spread, 2 days on the trail, sleeping out under the September sky. It was the kind of trip that was logistically simple and physically tiring, and that Gideon found, somewhere in the middle of the second day, to be one of the better days he could remember in a life that had not been short of good days, once he'd started paying attention to them. They drove the cattle in through the main gate of the Hennessy place at mid-afternoon on the second day. The animals went into the east pasture Mara's configuration, the drainage running correctly, the fence posts set true and stood there in their new surroundings, making the assessments that cattle make, which are entirely practical and have nothing to do with sentiment. Mara sat on her horse and watched them settle. 6, she said. To start, Gideon said. To start, she agreed. He looked at her profile in the September light, the straight back, the hat she'd worn through 3 seasons of hard work on this property, the particular set of her jaw that meant she was looking at something and seeing not just what it was, but what it could become. He had been looking at that profile for 4 years before he let himself understand what it meant to him, and now he looked at it and felt the specific warmth of a man who has stopped fighting the best thing in his life. Mara, he said. She turned. Thank you, he said. For waiting until I figured it out. She looked at him for a moment. The September light, the cattle settling in the east pasture. The property around them that was theirs imperfect, rough, years from finished, and entirely theirs. I didn't wait, she said. I stayed. There's a difference. He thought about that. What's the difference? Waiting is passive, she said. I stayed because I wanted to, because I could see what you were, even when you couldn't. She turned back to the cattle. I'm not interested in credit for patience. I'm interested in where we're going from here. He looked at the east pasture, 6 cattle, a working well. A roof that no longer leaked. A fence built right. North pasture needs work before winter, he said. I know. I was thinking about it on the trail. We'll need another hand by spring if we're expanding. I have someone in mind, one of the Riley boys, the younger one. He works hard and he doesn't talk more than necessary. High praise. From me, yes. She gathered her reins. Come on, we should check the well pressure before dark. She rode toward the farmhouse, and he followed, and the cattle settled in the east pasture behind them as the September afternoon moved toward evening. The winter that came at the end of that year was hard in the way that all Wyoming winters were hard, but it was the first one that Gideon spent with a clear sense of what he was working for, which made it different from all the winters before it in a way he couldn't entirely articulate but could feel precisely. The Hennessy place held, the well held. The cattle went through the season with normal losses, 1 calf, which hurt the way it always hurt, and came out the other side in reasonable condition. The north pasture fencing they'd done in October, pushing hard before the ground froze, proved solid when the drifts came, and the fence had to bear the weight of cattle pressing against it for warmth. On a February evening during a rare break in the cold, Gideon sat at the kitchen table with the ledger Mara kept on the Hennessy operation and went through the numbers slowly and carefully. He was not as fast at this as she was, and the columns required more attention from him than they would have from her. But he went through them, because the numbers were his to know as much as hers, and he'd spent enough of his life having other people's finances be the ones that mattered. The numbers were not comfortable, they were not surplus. But they were honest, and they added up correctly, and the trajectory they described, if you extended it 2 years forward at the same rate, was a property that was paying its own way. He closed the ledger and looked at the window where the canning jar had been replaced twice since August, each time with whatever Mara had found worth keeping from the season. Right now it held 3 dried seed heads from the east field, dark against the winter light. The kind of thing that looked like nothing in particular until you understood what they meant, that she'd been thinking about next year's planting while this year was still happening. He heard her come in from the barn, the particular sequence of sounds door, boots, the brief muttering of the temperature she always made when coming in from serious cold, coat on the hook. She came into the kitchen, rubbing her hands together, and looked at the closed ledger on the table. Numbers? She said. Good enough. She looked at his face, which she read the way she read fence lines for the information it was actually giving, rather than the information she expected. What is it? He thought about how to say it. He was better at saying things than he used to be, which was one of the things that living with someone who valued directness had given him, but he was still not fast at it. I was thinking about what it took, he said, to get here, and what I almost let stop it. She sat down across from him. She didn't say anything, which was her way of giving him room to continue or not, as he chose. I spent 32 years with a specific idea of what I was worth, he said, and what I was worth was determined by what I had, which was never much. and I used that to keep myself from reaching, from wanting things I thought I didn't have the right to want. He looked at the ledger. I came this close to letting your father's letter change nothing. Standing in that barn and watching you walk away and telling myself it was the right thing for you and meaning it. I know, she said quietly. If I'd done that, he said. If I'd stayed quiet and let it run. Don't, she said. Don't trace the alternate path. You didn't. I almost did. Almost is not the same as did, she said. I know you know that because you built 6 months of fence and a working well and a herd out of almost. Almost is just where things start before someone decides. He looked at her. The February light was thin and pale through the window, the seed heads dark in their jar, the kitchen rough and functional and warmer than it had any right to be given the state of the window ceiling on the east wall, which was next on his list. I was afraid, he said, for a long time, of being the wrong amount of everything. I know, she said. You don't have to explain it. I understood it before you did. That's what makes it worse a little. Or better, she said, depending on how you look at it. I saw what you were before you believed it. That's not a tragedy. That's how it happened. He thought about what her mother had told her, the things she'd said to him in the barn in October. The hardest men to love are the ones who don't believe they deserve it. She said the love doesn't run out. They just keep testing it until they're certain it won't. He hadn't run out of tests. She had not run out of love. That was the plain math of it, and if he could have gone back and told himself that at 30, at 25, at any of the years when he'd been quietly deciding he was not enough, he didn't know if he would have believed it. But it was true. It had been true regardless of whether he believed it. Your mother was a smart woman, he said. Mara looked at him with an expression that was complicated and warm and slightly surprised. What made you think of her? Something she told you that you told me. In the barn, about how men who don't believe they deserve love just keep testing it. Mara was quiet for a moment. She told me that about my father originally, she said. Before he figured himself out, Gideon considered that. Silas. He didn't believe he was good enough for her. For the first 3 years they were married, Mara said. She said it took him that long to stop waiting for her to realize she'd made a mistake. She looked at the window. He never told me that himself. She did the winter before she died. I think she wanted me to know it so I'd understand him better. And so I'd recognize it if I ever saw it in someone else. The February wind moved against the east wall. The seed heads in the jar were still. She sounds like she was a remarkable woman, Gideon said. She was ordinary in all the best ways, Mara said. She worked hard and she loved her family, and she was right about most things and wrong about a few, and she never pretended otherwise. A pause. I think that's what remarkable actually looks like, most of the time. He thought that was probably true. Spring came the way it had the spring before, and the spring before that not gently, not gradually, but with the particular suddenness of Wyoming weather that went from winter to mud to green in what felt like a single week. The kitchen garden went in on the south wall of the farmhouse in the last week of April, Mara working the soil with the focus she brought to anything she'd been thinking about through a long winter. Gideon built her the frame for it on a Saturday afternoon, working from a rough sketch she'd drawn on the back of a feed receipt. It was not his best carpentry work. The corners were acceptable rather than perfect, and one of the side rails had a slight bow in it that bothered him more than it bothered her. It's fine, she said, looking at the bow. It's off by about an inch. The seeds don't know that, she said, and got back to work. Silas came out the following Sunday. He went to the well first. As he always did, Gideon had come to understand that the well was the thing Silas used to measure the property, the reliable indicator of whether the whole enterprise was holding together. And every visit he went to the well and pumped the handle once and observed the water and then moved on. It was never commented on. It was simply done. This Sunday he went to the well, and then he walked to the south wall of the farmhouse and stood looking at the kitchen garden frame with the newly turned soil inside it and the seed markers Mara had placed with. The same precision she applied to the ranch ledgers. He stood there for a while, When he turned around, his face was doing the thing it had done. That August evening at the fence, the private, quick movement, and then the settling. He didn't say anything about the garden. He said, "The north pasture's coming in better than I expected." "We'll put 8 more head in it by June," Gideon said. "If Riley's got what I think he's got." "He will," Silas said. "Call him this week, before someone else does. I'll ride out Tuesday." They walked the north pasture together, and then the east, and Silas had opinions about the east fence drainage, not critical ones. Just the practiced observations of a man who had looked at land for 30 years and couldn't turn it off. And Gideon listened to all of them and agreed with the ones that were right, and offered a different view on the ones that weren't. And Silas accepted the different view on about half of them, which for Silas was the equivalent of enthusiastic agreement. At the end of the afternoon, before he got in his buggy, Silas stood in the yard of the Hennessy place, which had not been called the Hennessy place by anyone in the county for the better part of a year, because the county had already started calling it the Rusk place without anyone deciding to do so, the way these things happen when a property has new people working it and those people are present enough to become what the property is known for. He stood in the yard and looked at the farmhouse and the working well and the pastures with their solid fence lines and the kitchen garden on the south wall and the property generally, which was not finished and might not ever be entirely finished because a working ranch is always in the process of becoming rather than the state of being done. He looked at all of it. Then he looked at Gideon. "I wrote those letters to Edmund Carraway," he said, "because I was afraid." "I told you that." He paused. "I was afraid of the wrong things. A man with a city coat and good horses and a house in Cheyenne. As if any of that was the thing that was going to keep my daughter safe when the hard seasons came." Gideon said nothing. "What keeps a person safe in the hard seasons," Silas said slowly, "is someone beside them who doesn't leave. Who knows the work and does it, and is there the next morning and the morning after that." He looked at the farmhouse again. "Eleanor was that for me. I knew it. I just forgot for a while what it actually looked like from the outside." "Silas," Gideon said. "I'm not apologizing," Silas said. "I'm explaining. There's a difference." He picked up his reins. "You're a good husband. You're a better rancher than I gave you credit for when I was paying you to be a foreman. And you're going to be." He stopped. He cleared his throat. "Mara is well," he said. "That's what I'm saying. She is well." He got in the buggy and drove out through the gate and down the county road without looking back, because he was Silas, and he had said the thing, and the thing was said, and that was the end of it. Gideon stood in the yard and watched the buggy go and thought about the word well. Such a small word for such a large thing. Not happy, Silas would never have said happy. It was too temporary a state to stake anything on. Not successful, not secure, not any of the words that had been underneath his original calculations about Edmund Carraway. Well present, capable, in the right life, with the right person, doing work that meant something. That was what well meant, when a man like Silas Whitlock used it about his daughter. Mara came out of the farmhouse with 2 cups of coffee and gave him one and stood beside him in the afternoon light, following his gaze down the county road where the buggy had disappeared. "What did he say?" she asked. "He said you're well." She was quiet for a moment. That's the nicest thing he knows how to say. "I know." She drank her coffee. He drank his. The spring afternoon moved around them, warm and purposeful, the kind of afternoon that felt like a promise about the season that was coming. "Riley on Tuesday," she said. "Riley on Tuesday," he confirmed. 8 head for the north pasture, if he's got good stock. "I won't push the number if the quality's not there." "No," she agreed. "Quality over number, always." They stood in the yard of their property, on their land, under the Wyoming sky that had been there long before them and would be there long after, and the ranch that was still becoming what it was going to be, spread out in every direction around them, imperfect and ongoing and real. Years later, and there would be years, the kind that stacked up without ceremony, each one built from the same materials as the last but slightly different in weight and texture, the county would remember the Rusk operation as one of the solid ones. Not the largest, not the flashiest, just solid. The way things are solid when they're built by people who understand that a foundation is not a thing you pour once and walk away from, but a thing you maintain, season by season, year after year, with the same attention you bring to it on the first day. They would remember Gideon Rusk as the man who had been a foreman and then became something else. And they would not entirely agree on the moment the change had happened, whether it was the night of the fence, the deed, or the well, or the 6 cattle in the east pasture. The truth was it had been happening the whole time, slower than anyone watching could see, the way water finds its way through rock, not by force but by persistence. And they would remember Mara Rusk as a woman who had known her own mind when it was not fashionable to say so, and who had been right about what she knew, and who had built something alongside a man she'd chosen herself, which was the kind of thing that only looks simple from a distance. Silas Whitlock lived long enough to see his daughter's name on a deed, which was what he'd wanted from the beginning, without knowing what it was supposed to look like. He came out to the Rusk place on a September afternoon in the year that Gideon and Mara drove their first substantial herd across the north pasture and into the Whitlock range on a grazing agreement that made them proper partners with the main operation rather than its auxiliary, and he stood at the fence and watched the cattle move and said nothing for a long time. Mara stood beside him. Gideon stood on the other side. The 3 of them watched the cattle cross onto the range in the September light, the herd that had started at 6 and grown into something real by the work of 2 people who had each brought things the other lacked and had figured out, across several difficult years, how to fit those things together without either of them having to become less than what they were. 42 head, Silas said finally. 42, Gideon confirmed. Silas was quiet for another long moment. My late wife, he said slowly, would have something to say about this. He didn't specify what Eleanor would have said. He didn't need to. They both understood that she would have said something precise and clear and correct, the way she always had, and that it probably would have been some version of I told you so, directed at Silas, about a decision he'd been slow to make. What would you say? Mara asked him. He looked at the cattle. He looked at the land. He looked at his daughter and at the man beside her who had come to his ranch 4 years before with a horse and a reputation for finishing difficult work and had finished, among other difficult things, the work of becoming someone. I'd say, Silas said, carefully, that I was wrong about what security looks like. And I'd say that being wrong about that was the luckiest mistake I ever made. He paused. Because if I'd been right, and if you'd listened to me, none of this would be here. Mara put her hand through her father's arm, which was the most affectionate gesture the 2 of them managed in public, and Silas let her keep it there, which was the most he allowed himself to receive. The 42 head moved across the range in the September afternoon. The fence line held. The mountains to the west were doing what they always did standing there, permanent and enormous and entirely indifferent to the small human dramas unfolding below them, which was strangely comforting when you thought about it. Not everything lasts. Most things don't, but some things, the things built slowly, without shortcuts, by people willing to be wrong and say so, and keep working anyway, some things hold. The Rusk place held, not because it was easy, and not because the people building it were exceptional in any obvious way, but because 2 people had looked at something that could have been and had decided, separately and then together, that it was worth the work of making it real. That was the whole of it. That was enough.